Welcome to our after lunch event. Proud to introduce Jonathan Ryder with Dragos. We'll be discussing protectionism, national security, and protocols, the case with Internet for plant automation. For everyone here, keep in mind, please, there's a raffle to get your passport stamped out in the exhibit hall, as I understand it. Just got a quick message about that, so if you want to get in the raffle, go ahead and do that. And here's John.
Thanks, David. So hi, I'm Jonathan. Welcome to a talk about an uncommon industrial protocol. It's called EPA, or Ethernet for Plant Automation, and it's the pride and joy of a generational research effort within China. So this talk does require a basic understanding of networking and perhaps industrial networking standards. I'm gonna go through a lot of political context of the industrial policy in China. I've tried my best to make it approachable for all people, but if you do have questions, please get in contact with me with my points that I have with my first slide. I'll return to it at the end of the talk. I won't take public questions, but I will have a hallway track immediately after this. You're gonna wanna stay for this talk. I've never seen a talk about EPA, at least not in the public, and there's very few papers about it. This is despite the fact that there's many innovations within it that are super straightforward, and there's evidence that's pretty ubiquitous in sensitive environments. This could be like power plants in China. It also has a public IEC standard. It is one of the CPFs of real-time Ethernet. So EPA is a technology that was created during the internet boom. And it was to fulfill the whims of globalization of a country that was rapidly ascending the value chain of industrialization. It's also potentially a protocol your hardware and software might support. I'll go over the implications of this in some detail, but I will admit first and foremost that this is an area of continuing research. And I will talk about where I've gone with my research. If you have heard of Ethernet for plant automation, I'd like to talk to you first and foremost, so we can get to the bottom of its use. So why am I talking about an unknown industrial protocol? It's part of me at this point. My day job in Dragos, I built telemetry systems and detection engineering systems. I've done serious research and built predictive analytics on a range of topics. I've also formally studied industrialization and developmental economics of China, and I occasionally contribute research related to PRC-based threat actors and tool sets. There are few sources of EPA that are widely available. As I mentioned previously, the IEC docs have been retracted. So the first IEC doc was IEC 62409, and it existed between 2005 and 2007. And there are many variations between it and the national documents, the GBT series that China uses for their own national electronics regulations. And all of these are only selectively available in translated formats. For IEC, for instance, you're gonna be paying $200 for IEC 62409. And again, it's just a CPF. And the GBT documents, let's just say it requires some fine scraping in order to actually get access to. And also, 99% of the time, you're not gonna get an English translation. So a summary of all these facts is sorely needed. So what is EPA? EPA is Ethernet for plant automation, and simply put, China's national competitor to a world of real-time Ethernet standards. And it was eventually adopted as one of the many field bus profiles under IEC 617842 as CPF 14. The standards history is a little bit more complex than that, but it's easier to think of it as similar to other RTE systems as a software protocol built on top of Ethernet layer 3 on up. We're gonna get into a little bit more detail with it. There's gonna be a protocol spec. Please keep your eyes from glazing over. This approach, using RTE, is not out of line, and for both technological and political objectives, where EPA was an outgrowth of planning that started its codification in 2002. Profinet, for example, blossomed around the same point in time under the same evolution over Profibus, is to lift up an old favorite in a standard physical medium, 100 base TX, and then take the advantage of increasing economies of scale of Ethernet to standardize. And then just as with Profinet, EPA attempts to be all things to all people. It contains 4 different objectives, 2 different real-time conventions, plus it supports streaming media and conventional TCP/IP over Ethernet. All this operates off a redundantly switched system, and this in turn operates off its own bespoke safety system, which is under IEC 61784-314, and it got SIL3 certification. So, blah, 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 it's pretty robust in its own way for industrial applications. So to be more expansive, to summarize, to unpack everything I just said, 4 things. 1, it supports a real-time, that is less than or equal to 1 millisecond of latency, data exchange solution on top of TCP/IP, fit for multiple distinct use cases. 2, as a communication protocol model that's been optimized, and it provides a bypass for real-time channels. 3, it has centralized scheduling to improve latencies and avoid collisions, that whole fun Ethernet thing. And then 4 is INTEBUS style lumped frame communication method, and it uses a bus topology. So to make sense of this weird gumbo of protocol parts, I'm gonna throw you headlong into the protocol diagram. Please do not panic. We are mostly adults here. We can eat our vegetables. So here is the wire diagram. So you can see left to right, you have the fast real time, you have the real time, you have what they call the block real time, and then you have the not real time. The not will go, and then top to bottom, that's your protocol stack. At the physical at the very bottom, which again, it's IEEE 802 for the most part, and then you go up and it's the application layer. From right to left, not real time, it supports TCP/IP, your IT applications on the same network as block real time. Block real time means streaming media, Hikvision cameras supporting 1 megabits per second and 25 frames per second. The other to the left, you have real time, which is not critical, but still use the EPA communication scheduling management entity to allow routing of less than 1 millisecond traffic. And then fast real time, which that has absolute guarantees of less than 1 millisecond latency. And so really what you get out of this is a split use case that comes down to the communication scheduling management entity. It exists at the link layer of the stack. It's more or less firmware, and it operates as a scheduler. It operates as a watchdog on every EPA-enabled device, and what it does is it inscribes into data frames this indicator that's called the DLS user, and then it caches the DLS user and helps it route packets accordingly. And it also will order packets within memory to account for the fast real-time use case, causing downstream congestion as less important packets get cached more or less. Ultimately, this algorithm assumes a primary and secondary node to operate correctly, and the sources imply this tends to span network interfaces. Principally, the primary of this networking topology is called it's the so-called EPA bridge router. It's an EPA-enabled router that supports this caching. And what it does is it will forward packets to VLANs as a modern router should. And again, to really underline how weird this is, this same algorithm applies to block traffic. Streaming media, sources talked about a Hikvision camera, again, 1 megabit per second, 25 frames per second, existing on the same network as your critical infrastructure. And so in general, what you get out of the design system is pretty clear. Central control systems allow limited traffic to elide from the assumptions of CSMA CD. And it allows you to do this while capturing the advantages of commodity Ethernet, i.e. it's cheap as hell. This is not an unknown pattern, but packing critical, I went ahead a little bit. But packing critical and non-critical workloads on the same wires is, I think, kind of novel. And as a practical example, on GitHub, there is an implementation of DHCP on EPA. It's under a user called Salme 123456789. Salme means strawberry, more likely than not. It's still up there. Feel free to fork it if you want. It's a project built for, it's all Verilog source code, and it's for Quartus 2 Altera FPGA. And the whole thing is to support DHCP alongside the EPA protocol. I've not fully verified this code. I verified parts of it. Verilator seems to have promising outputs. It does require proprietary Intel RTL files and some of the use of their proprietary FPGA cross-gen binary, which I haven't yet figured out. So sue me, I'm not a design engineer. Okay, so while there's a lot more to talk about for the protocol, we should talk about how we got to it and who implements it. As mentioned previously, the protocol came in the world where Ethernet was making industrial automation cheaper. And while foreign direct investment in the PRC was at its peak, launched under Deng Xiaoping, the 863 program was a high-profile crash research program that gave birth to EPA. Several academics affiliated with the China Academy of Sciences, they channeled their efforts into EPA. Principle of this talk is, okay, now it's jumping ahead. Give me 1 second. Oops, I should go backwards. Can we bring up the slides? I'm sorry. The bug reoccurred. Tech support? Yeah, tech support. No, I'm sorry. Okay, bear with me. Play the interstitial music that I've prepared. No, there is no prepared interstitial music. Okay. I have control again, and this time I will not go forward repeatedly, just to spite everybody. Okay, so academics involved with this. So one is, of Zhejiang University, there's one Feng Dongxin and Chu Jian, and they have a loose cadre of fellow engineers and scientists, and they ended up founding a company called Supcon. And on top of that, there are other individuals associated with Kailand, which I'll get into a little bit more detail about. But the main point I want to drive in here is there's a variety of state and private institutions that created this evolution, this new real-time Ethernet protocol, both signed national and IEC regulation, as well as organizations that got involved later. The theme I want to get into this is that it followed a techno-nationalist approach to developing industrial protocols. And it's closer to the norm than being a one-off for the PRC. Directed industrial policy was distinct among Asian tigers around the time that EPA came about, 2002 and on. Okay, let me back up. Okay, there we go. I have control. For example, another Asian tiger is Mitsubishi Electric's MALSEC protocol, which is an outflow of CC-Link, and it came out of the same kind of standard economics of scale conditions, which EPA came about. For this economies of scale, it caused a flux in the standards for EPA, which is kind of interesting to see. So originally they had their own standard, which was IEC Pass 62409, to eventually become a communication profile under IEC 61784 CPF 14, and it happened pretty abruptly. And by most accounts, this happened because the actual researchers on EPA didn't expect being so far ahead of the global standard. But such public-private partnerships not only influenced the growth of Supcon into a leading DCS vendor in China, with kind of a known product which I'll return to that's called the JX300XP DCS, it also gave rise to an ecosystem. Kailand, another contributor that I mentioned, specializes in routers for EPA. Going back again. I know you want to see that slide so badly. Kailand specializes in the Sitcom series of EPA-enabled industrial routers, mostly riding off of an I/O chip they made called the KD5660, which helps in the use of EPA peering. Interestingly, Kailand and some of their subsidiaries are on US entity lists since 2021. My point being is that China's growth dynamic has changed over time. We've reached a critical point in history with increased balkanization of trade between the US and China. It's possible such a change will stimulate a greater reliance on national standards, such as EPA, for China. It's also possible that firms in the US have adopted solutions that support EPA, which is a very important point I'd like to focus on later. So, now we actually get to the vaunted slide. Enough generalities, let's get into some actual deployments of this. Thank you. So here's a typical greenfield deployment okay, now it's flipping ahead a little fast. So here's a typical greenfield deployment. This is via Feng et al. 2012, which is a textbook. In 2005, the Huadong pharmaceutical plant in Hangzhou decided to go an upgrade route and use EPA. They make acarbose, which is used for managing type 2 diabetes. They have a large-scale deployment, around 22 tanks, 100 control points. In this case, control means it manages flow control of the fermentation process for the acarbose production process. And what the fermentation process requires is periodic transmission interval allocated at 1 millisecond at the most, with no tolerance for packet loss at all. The process was part of a full conversion of a typical analog signal system into digital. So it was basically their main digital transformation. They deployed 30 EPA-enabled pressure sensors, 20 EPA temperature transmitters, and 4 flow meters. And this deployment was the first fully automated remote pharmaceutical plant for this company. Now we go on to my next slide, which is a second case with different gear, different timeline, different industry. In 2020, Heilongjiang Longmei Hagong Mining made a deployment of EPA-based systems. They're running into operational challenges at the end of a PLC line, which in this case was the G9030 Fanuc PLC. I don't think they had a DCS system, to be sure, so it was like an upgrade case for them. Their Fanucs were running TCP/IP, so moving to an EPA-based system, again, Ethernet and TCP/IP intercom was kind of a natural change. And, okay, going back once more, there we go. Moving to a subcom webfield DCS, which in this case is the JX300XP DCS, and they switched up their PLCs going to bespoke PLCs rather than GE Fanuc brand. Shenyang University created their own PLCs for their use case. And this is a large-scale change. 25 cameras, again, the bulk, the streaming media use case. 30 switches, which are used for mining, back mining PLCs. And then 10 kilometers of armored optical cable was used in the deployment. This happened because surveillance was needed to be integrated with a coal production system. And in this case, EPA enabled this. Okay, so I've gone through this pretty quickly, and there's a lot of material, and if you've had trouble keeping up, don't worry, I'm having problems too. The final part of my presentation catalogs everything we just don't know yet about EPA, or stuff that is not yet public. So we've gone through the algorithm, who's interested in making things with EPA, and even some examples of deployments in the field. I want to talk about some of the details in the research and some extensions. The body of the intelligence from this paper has come from public and untranslated books and papers as well. I've also done some clever retro hunts on VirusTotal to get some of my material. I've also shown the open source development and that Verilog source. But it's worth noting that by and large, the body of this work is domestic in nature. The source of data or implementations of EPA are very rare. As for now, we do not have a complete list of vendors who support EPA. We don't have the models of DCS that they support. Bounce back, please. There we go. We don't have the models of DCS or HMI or other systems that support EPA. We don't know yet the market share of the protocol atop the set of all assets in the PRC, let alone the world. But I'll admit such data is rare outside of the US. Telemetry providers generally are very jealous of their data. Boop, there we go. And the work of ICS demographic systems don't really capture this. Most relevant as an example is a system called Detecting, which is a system hosted by Professor Yu Yao of Northeastern University, which is based in Shenyang in China. Well, it captures Modbus systems quite accurately relative to other scanners like Shodan or FOFA. None of the scanners mentioned appear to have documented detections of internet-facing EPA systems. I've actually had not much success finding internet-facing EPA systems, which is probably both good and bad, but it also is probably a byproduct of not knowing the full population of models that support EPA. More practically, we don't know the host or networking security measures that are predominant in these environments. It's merely referenced with no elaboration in most cases in the textbooks, despite more vintage ICS security textbooks mentioning use of honeypot, Suricata, use of Kingsoft or Qianxin host scanners as its broader domestic security solutions. We critically do not know whether the support is within the critical code path, such that EPA functionality is available with global SKUs of industrial networking gear. We don't know the effective support of EPA on common or ordinary operations of complex DCS. This might be a reasonable risk to take in some environments, but we live in strange times where sensitive operators, such as the Marine Corps and the UK National Grid, are tearing out systems that have any whiff of surveillance that the PRC is attached to. So if you were an operator and you've seen mentions of EPA, which is not environmental in nature, but instead protocol in nature, and you have in your system architecture, we should have a discussion right after this talk. We can do some work together. As for translation, reversing material, and all other sources that I've talked about, I intend to publicize this in the near future, as the capabilities of EPA really communicate a lot about the developments with digital transformation over the last 20 years. So here is my abridged biography and credits. I really couldn't have done it without my unnamed co-contributors and partially named contributors. So again, if you have any notes about EPA, I'd love to get and talk to you, and there is some ongoing research. So if you have any questions, feel free to hallway track me immediately after this word. Thank you. Yes?
Can you differentiate this between like AFDX or ARINC 664, other deterministic real-time internet technologies? Trouble figuring out why they did this when they're already deterministic.
When did those solutions exist?
Since 2012, for sure. I mean, we're
EPA is from 2002. Yeah, that's when they started on the protocol. Yeah. So he asked why Ethernet for plant automation would be used in place of another RTE, and what I am confirming is the EPA standard got started in 2002. My first use case was from 2005 as well. So my point being, EPA is ahead of the curve. Like, they pretty much set the standard for RTE. They were the CPF I mentioned, that was like 2000, or rather not the CPF, but their own IEC standard. It was launched in 2005 to 2007. So they were around 2007 was when the official standard for RTE was starting to be built. And they're like, oh crap, we're like a decade ahead of the game. Which, I mean, to be fair, it's a very crowded field. So the reason why EPA exists, like all other RTE standards, is because a standard was created, therefore you have to create another standard, right? Yeah, they're all kind of accumulative in nature. But that is a good note about it being used in avionics. I have some notes I want to compare with you at that point. So, yeah. Thank you very much for attending my talk.